Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek and I'm here today with part 5 of our series on World War II, looking at the war in Europe and in North Africa. So now we are finally into America getting involved in the actual fighting of the war. Now, in spite of the attack on Pearl Harbor, remember that Germany and Italy also declared war on the United States, and Allied leaders decided to first focus on Germany and Italy in Europe. And the reason for this is that their forces occupied almost all of Europe and North Africa, and the fear was that if Hitler was able to defeat the Soviet Union, Germany might become unstoppable. So rather than attacking Japan first, Allied forces went for the German and Italian soldiers in Europe and North Africa. So the Allies first attacked in North Africa with troops landing in Algeria and Morocco on November 8th, 1942. These troops began to move east, while British troops moved west from Libya and into Tunisia, ultimately forcing a surrender in May of 1943. So in a period of about 7 months, these two sides were able to pinch together and drive Axis soldiers out of North Africa. Now this campaign was fought almost entirely in the desert, and a very different kind of warfare, and one that's not usually shown a lot in regard to remembering World War II. We normally remember fighting in Europe against Germany and fighting in the Pacific against Japan, but this was actually the first action that American troops saw in World War II. So just to give you a picture of how the North African campaign worked, you had British forces in Egypt, and then you had American and other Allied forces that would land in Morocco, and you can see that they just both advanced across North Africa, driving the Axis troops out, and then back across the Mediterranean Sea and into Italy. Now, once they had gained their victory in North Africa, the Allies would launch an invasion of Italy in the summer of 1943. And what happened is, as the Allies advanced, Italians would overthrow Benito Mussolini and surrender to the Allies. And what would happen is Mussolini would be rescued by German special forces. Then later on down the road, when the war was ending, he tried to escape. He was arrested and executed, and then his body was actually displayed at a service station for all people to see and get confirmation that, yes, our dictator is now dead. But the Italians would surrender to the Allies, but even with Italy out of the picture, German troops would continue to fight. And so it was a difficult move through Italy. There were still a lot of German soldiers there defending it. But in the end, the Allies were able to liberate Rome by June of 1944, so basically a year later. And there are Allied soldiers marching into Rome. And the Allied armies would continue north through the rest of the war, ultimately breaking through the borders of Italy all the way in the north in the spring of 1945. So just continued fighting. It was kind of a slow grind getting through Italy, but one that in the end ultimately would pay off for the Allies. So if we go back here to our map, following the North Africa campaign, troops were sent across the Mediterranean into Sicily, first and foremost. Then once Sicily was conquered, they would continue to advance north and head on up to Rome. And then after conquering Rome, they would continue north through the rest of the war. Now, while the rest of the Allies were preparing to invade Western Europe, there was fighting going on in Italy also. During this time, the Soviet Union was the main focus of the German attack. And after they had first invaded in June of 1941, Germany moved through the Soviet interior pretty quickly. And it did not look good for a little while. But then, for example, there was a 900-day siege on Leningrad, so basically 2.5 years, that would begin in September of 1941, and this siege would never break through. And there are stories of the people of Leningrad living through this destruction, having to do things like eat bread that was made from wallpaper paste because they couldn't get food through. But the city itself never ever fell, and this was one of the great failures of Germany's campaign through the Soviet Union. So there are just some pictures of the destruction that Leningrad went through, but again, a city that would never fall into German hands. And while this siege was going on, the Soviet Red Army would repel several other German attacks, including one on the capital city of Moscow that was fought from October of 1941 to January of 1942. And in the spring of 1942, Germany would also attack Stalingrad, which, yes, Stalingrad, of course, was named after Joseph Stalin. Remember, he is Mr. Cult of Personality and naming cities and everything after himself. Now, Germany would eventually take the city, but Soviet relief forces that had come in would soon surround Stalingrad and force the Germans who had taken the city to surrender in February of 1943. So these three cities were just three examples of the failures of the German army in attempting to conquer the Soviet Union, and really a testament to just the fierce nature of the Red Army, their unwillingness to go down, and again, Germany was never able to fully conquer the Soviet Union, and in fact, would eventually start to get pushed back west out of the lands that they had originally advanced through on their first invasion. So you can see here on the map, I've got the three stars. They're color-coded for Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, just to show you where these three cities were in relation to lands that the German Empire ever actually conquered. You can see that they had to advance quite a ways in to get to Moscow and were never really able to get any sort of control. And then after repelling these attacks, Russia would continue to battle back and eventually push Germany farther and farther west out of their territory. Now, while this fighting was going on in the Soviet Union, the Allied forces were getting ready to invade from the west. And on June 6th of 1944, on a day known as D-Day, Allied troops landed on Normandy Beach in France. Now, early in the morning, so we're talking, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, airborne troops were dropped out of planes behind enemy lines, and then ground troops started landing on the beaches at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th. So there's a picture of the Marines who landed on Normandy Beach. You can see they would come in these transport boats. They would, storm onto the beach, find some cover, and try and advance and get any kind of hold inland, while the Allied paratroopers who had been dropped were looking to work their way towards the beach to sort of surround the Germans and force them out and set up some sort of control in France. Now, these soldiers fought fiercely against German fire. There were a lot of casualties, as soldiers were storming onto the beach. They're basically sitting ducks for all of these German soldiers who were waiting for them. But D-Day was ultimately a success and set the stage for 1 million Allied troops to land in France within weeks. So you can see the second picture there showing these giant transport ships and air support that were able to land in France after they had taken the beach. And again, just providing the Allied advance with the troops that it would require. Now, after the successful landing on D-Day, the Allied troops' first goal was to advance through France, which they did. They were able to liberate Paris on August 25th, so about 2.5 months after first landing in Normandy. There is a picture of Allied troops marching into Paris. And then from Paris, the Allies would continue east, ultimately slowing along the Rhine River. And so the Rhine River was sort of the stopping point of the Allied advance at first. It was the site of a few major battles, and it was sort of the final step into eventually invading Germany and hopefully winning the war. And so you can see here on the map, we have Normandy marked with the orange star, and then troops, once they landed, some would advance west just to clear out the rest of northwestern France, but the majority of soldiers would advance east towards Belgium and, of course, obviously, towards Germany. And you can see that the red line there is the Rhine River that Allied forces were eventually slowed at, that would prove to be the site of some of the major battles going forward in the war. And at this time, the Soviet Union, of course, was continuing to push west, and now you can see just how much Germany had been squeezed compared to how much area they had controlled just a couple years earlier. And so with the rapid Allied advance, Germany was really pushed back pretty quickly, but they would launch a final surprise offensive in the winter of 1944 along a 50-mile stretch of forest in Belgium. Now, this attack created a bulge in the Allied line, hence where we get the battle's name, the Battle of the Bulge, and German troops began to advance west. And so if you look at the map, you can see the German advance heading west. They sometimes say that the bulge created in the Allied line, which is obviously the green area, sometimes looks like a nose, but this really threatened the Allied advance, just because if German troops were continued to allowed to move west, they could spread out and reclaim some of the territory that had been taken from them. But the Allies were able to launch a counteroffensive that would push the Germans back, and this actually proved to be the final serious German resistance. So once the Allies had gained victory in the Battle of the Bulge, it was just they were across the Rhine River and they could continue east into Germany and eventually into Berlin. Now, the Battle of the Bulge was the costliest battle for America in World War II, with almost 90,000 soldiers who died. And a lot of this was because it was during the winter. There was a lot of bombing that went on, so a lot of shrapnel and just a huge amount of casualties in this final German offensive. Now, as the war waged on, America had to cope with another major loss, which was the death of President Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945. Most scholars agree that President Roosevelt, who had gotten America out of the Great Depression, who was leading them to victory in World War II, is one of, if not the greatest presidents in our nation's history. And this was just a huge blow to America. And Vice President Harry Truman was the one who had to step in Roosevelt's enormous shoes. But by mid-April of 1945, the Soviet Union had surrounded the German capital of Berlin, and Allied troops were also pushing into Germany from the west. Now, Hitler and a number of other Nazi leaders realized that the situation was hopeless and would commit suicide in the coming days. Hitler himself would do so on April 30th, and then Germany, which was now in total disarray, would sign an unconditional surrender on May 7th of 1945, and the next day, May 8th, was known as VE Day, which stands for Victory in Europe. And this was a day that was celebrated around the world as an end to the tyranny of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Now, during the Allied advance, troops would find multiple examples of evidence of Hitler's final solution, which was the genocide of all Jewish people, which is more commonly known as the Holocaust. And we talked about how Hitler wanted to exterminate all 11 million of the world's Jews from this earth. And what he had originally done was capture and kill thousands of Jews and then set up concentration camps that would imprison thousands more. And in other areas, the Nazis would create ghettos, which would segregate Jews from non-Jews. And those who lived in ghettos were given minimal food and forced to live in extremely cramped housing, sometimes even up to 12 or even 30 people per room. So just incredibly inhumane treatment that was experienced even at the beginning of the war. But then as the war progressed, Hitler and Germany would also create death camps, and Jews were often packed into train cars and sent to these camps, and then those who had survived the ride were killed in gas chambers. Just unbelievably inhumane and sad moment in our world's history, where over 6 million Jews were killed, as well as millions more Soviet prisoners, gypsies, and handicapped peoples. Just again, one of the worst chapters in the history of our world. The Holocaust is something that I don't know if the world will ever totally heal from. But that's all I have for you in this video looking at the war in Europe. I will be back soon with our final installment where we will look at the war in Japan. And until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.